Hello everyone, and welcome to the wonderful recap of Oz. My name is Justin Peavy, and I will be reading through L. Frank Baum's novels and diving into a few of the countless film, television, stage, and literary adaptations taking place in the magical land of Oz. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you to everyone who listened to episode 1 and has decided to come back this week to hear more. This next installment of the Oz series, entitled The Marvelous Land of Oz, was published in 1904, 4 years after its predecessor. Baum dedicated this book to David C. Montgomery and Fred A. Stone. The two of them played the Tin Woodman and the Scarecrow respectively in the successful stage adaptation of The Wizard of Oz that first premiered in 1902. I plan to cover the details of this musical in a future episode, so I won't go too far into it right now, but it was the success of the stage show that led Baum to write further installments in the Oz series, so I think this is a pretty cool gesture on Baum's part. The tone of this book is noticeably more fantastical, while The Wonderful Wizard of Oz felt more like your typical old-fashioned fairy tale. This one reads much more like a child's bedtime story, and it gives itself more room to be humorous. It has a smaller, body count than the first book. In fact, I don't think anyone or anything dies in this one. And as I go through the summary, I may be proven wrong, but this definitely does not feel as dark or threatening. I wonder if any of that has to do with the musical that came in between. I know that Baum wanted the musical to be aimed primarily towards children, while the creative team had different ideas for its target audience. I have not yet read the script for the musical or done extensive reading into the subject, but I'm curious to know if there was anything that led to this change in atmosphere, such as the overwhelming response to the Oz canon by children across the country. Now, without further ado, I present to you The Marvelous Land of Oz, being an account of the further adventures of the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman, and also the strange experiences of the highly magnified Wogglebug, Jack Pumpkinhead, the animated Sawhorse, and the Gump. The story being a sequel to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. We begin in Gillikin Country, which is in the northern quadrant of Oz, and we meet a young boy named Tipitarius, Tip for short. He has no recollection of his parents because he was raised by an old woman named Mombi, and he is essentially her servant. She is technically not a witch, as it's illegal in Oz, but she does indulge in the magical arts, so the Gillikin people do not associate with her. Not even Tip is fond of his guardian. After doing work one day, Tip decides to make a jack-o'-lantern to scare Mombi. After carving the face, he chooses to manufacture the form of a man and use the pumpkin as a head. While Mombi goes to the village for quote-unquote groceries, he chops some wood and gets to work on his creation. It's a day-long task, but the result is a very tall wooden man with hinged joints, so that Tip can position him however he likes. He dresses his creation with extra clothes from Mombi's trunk: purple pants, a red shirt, and a pink and white polka dot vest. Tip names the man Jack Pumpkinhead and positions him in the road just a little ways away from Mombi's house. Meanwhile, Mombi makes her way home from a crooked wizard's cave, where she had exchanged magic secrets for new recipes, magical powders, and powerful herbs. She was so focused on getting home that she mistook Jack Pumpkinhead as a Gillikin farmer, but upon further inspection, she sees Jack for what he really is. She decides to punish Tip for trying to scare her, but not before trying out her brand new powder of life. Tip notices Mombi with Jack and hides behind a hedge to watch her. She sprinkles the powder all over Jack, says the magic words, and Jack Pumpkinhead springs to life. Mombi is delighted that she was not swindled by the wizard, while Tip is somewhere between horrified and excited. He begins to laugh at the sight of an animated Jack, which reveals his location to Mombi. She threatens to punish him for making fun of her, and Tip asks what she will do with Jack now that he is alive. Mombi is not quite sure, and the three of them start for the house. Back at her farmhouse, Mombi leads Jack into an empty cow stable and locks him in. She then takes Tip inside and orders him to build a fire. Mombi then places a kettle over the fire and concocts a potion that will turn whoever drinks it into stone. The target, of course, is Tip, who she plans to transform into an ornament for her flower garden. The potion has to cool overnight, so she orders Tip to go to bed, and she does the same. Understandably, this has made Tip quite upset, so he decides to run away. After Mombi falls asleep, Tip sneaks into the cupboards and grabs some food. He then stumbles upon the powder of life and decides to take it, out of fear that Mombi may use it to make more mischief. He sneaks to the cow stable to free Jack, and the two of them take to the road and escape on foot. By morning, Tip is confident that they are far enough from Mombi's house to avoid getting caught, and he decides to have breakfast. He reveals that he's the one who created Jack, and because of this, Jack elects to call him Father. Tip tells Jack that if they continue south, they will reach the Emerald City. Jack, being only a few hours old and knowing nothing of the history of Oz, then receives a brief history lesson from Tip, who recounts the adventures of Dorothy and her friends. He decides to travel to the Emerald City with Jack so they can meet with the Scarecrow, who, thanks to the wizard, is now the King of Oz. On their journey, Tip reflects on how he made Jack. He regrets not taking greater care in fashioning the Pumpkinhead's limbs, but of course he had no idea that Jack would come to life. So instead, he comes up with ideas on how to remedy Jack's deficiencies. At the edge of a wood, Tip rests on an old sawhorse. Jack inquires about the horse that Tip is sitting on, and Tip explains that there are two kinds of horses. One that is living and has 4 legs and a tail, and one that is inanimate, a sawhorse. Jack points out that the horse Tip is sitting on must be a living one because it has a head and a tail. Upon further inspection, Tip sees that the body of the sawhorse was formed from a tree trunk, with a branch serving as a tail. It also has 2 knots that resemble eyes, and it appears to have been slightly chopped to give the illusion that it has a mouth. Tip explains that this sawhorse could never be alive because it's made out of wood. Jack points out that he is alive and also made out of wood. Tip then remembers that he has the powder of life. He sprinkles the powder onto the sawhorse and says the magic words, and the sawhorse begins to move. The sawhorse moves frantically, and Tip tries to shout to get the sawhorse's attention, but they come across the unfortunate discovery that the creature has no ears. The sawhorse eventually calms down and does not make an attempt to run away, so Tip takes out a knife and carves some ears out of tree bark and attaches them to the sawhorse. The first thing the sawhorse hears is a compliment from Jack. This startles him and he starts to run away. Tip calls him an idiot, which is super rude, and the sawhorse steps in a gopher hole, trips and falls over, which is super funny. Tip explains to the sawhorse that when he calls whoa, that means to stop, and that he should be wary of gopher holes in the future. Tip informs the sawhorse that he is responsible for bringing him to life and helps him back onto his feet. The sawhorse then pledges his obedience to Tip. Tip instructs the horse what specific commands mean and announces that they are going to the Emerald City. Jack has to ride on the sawhorse's back so he won't wear out his joints, so Tip adds an extra branch to the horse's back that Jack can hold on to. Once this is done, the crew continues their journey. They come across the yellow brick road with a sign reading 9 miles to the Emerald City. By now it's gotten dark, and Tip decides to camp by the roadside. The next morning, they start on the road immediately. After 2 miles, they come across a river. Tip is unsure how to cross, but then spots a man approaching in a small ferry boat. He agrees to row them across if they have money. They don't, so he declines, but he does suggest that Tip can ride across the river on the sawhorse. They do just this, with Jack Pumpkinhead grabbing hold of the horse's tail as the horse swims forward. On the other side of the river, the road continued. So Jack gets on the sawhorse's back and they go forth. Tip theorizes that their clothes will dry faster if the horse runs faster because of the wind. Tip grabs hold of the sawhorse's tail and they start running. However, the horse goes faster than Tip can keep up with. The tail snaps off in Tip's hand and he collapses. By the time he gets to his feet, the horse and Jack are out of sight. Tip rests, believing that he will cross paths with the two of them again if he continues on the road to the Emerald City. Meanwhile, Jack and the sawhorse haven't even noticed Tip's absence. They continue riding and arrive at the Emerald City gates. Jack turns around and discovers Tip is not there. Before he can contemplate what to do, the guardian of the gates comes out and addresses the guests. Jack introduces himself and reveals that he is not sure why he's come to the Emerald City. The guardian allows them inside because the horse and Jack seem harmless. They enter a small room where they are met by the soldier, who suggests that he bring Jack to His Majesty, the Scarecrow. The guardian puts green spectacles on Jack and the sawhorse, and they are led through the inner gate and into the main street. Jack is brought into the waiting room of the palace, and the sawhorse is led to the rear. The soldier, who is known for his green whiskers, announces Jack's presence, and the Scarecrow agrees to see Jack immediately. Jack, who has never met a Scarecrow before, was in awe of the king of the Emerald City. The Scarecrow was just as intrigued by Jack. The king asks where Jack came from, but Jack responds that he cannot understand the Scarecrow. He explains that he comes from Gilligan country, making him a foreigner who does not understand the Scarecrow's language. The Scarecrow, of course, speaking the language of the Munchkins, so he suggests they get an interpreter. This, of course, reads much funnier in the book because they are 100% speaking the exact same language, and it is Jack's naivete that has caused this impasse. Scarecrow asks the soldier to find someone who understands both languages. Scarecrow then asks Jack if he would like to sit, but Jack claims he cannot understand him, and if the Scarecrow wants him to sit, he'll have to signal for him to do so. The Scarecrow pushes Jack into a chair, which is a pretty clear sign. The soldier returns with a young girl, and the Scarecrow announces her name to be Jellia Jam. She claims to understand the languages of the Gillikins and the Munchkins, and agrees to interpret. What follows is even more miscommunication. Jellia plays a practical joke on the two of them by purposefully misinterpreting each other before explaining that everyone in Oz speaks the same language and they can actually understand each other. The Scarecrow realizes this to be true. Jack takes the blame, for he thought they spoke different languages because they come from different countries, and the Scarecrow suggests that maybe he should not think and just remain a dummy. Jack mentions that he did not ask to be born, and the Scarecrow relates to this sentiment, and realizing that the two of them have more in common than they thought, they decide to become friends. Tip walks quite a ways to the Emerald City and makes the discovery that he has run out of food to eat. He comes across a girl sitting by the roadside and eating lunch. She's wearing a gown reflecting the colors of Oz: emerald for the Emerald City, blue for the Munchkins, yellow for the Winkies, red for the Quadlings, and purple for the Gillikins. She abruptly announces that she has to leave, telling Tip to carry her basket and help himself to some of its contents. He does this and follows the woman with no questions asked. After he eats some lunch, the woman introduces herself as General Ginger of the all-female Army of Revolt. Tip was unaware that there was a war, and the general states that the army has been successful in maintaining the war's secrecy. She explains that women from all over the land of Oz are planning to overthrow and dethrone the Scarecrow, their argument being that men have ruled the Emerald City long enough. They also plan to take the city's gems and money and overthrow their male oppressors. They arrive at a clearing in the forest where there are 400 women preparing for battle. They're all wearing colors representing their country of origin, and the only weapons they carry are 2 knitting needles stuck in their hair. General Ginger commands the women to march towards the Emerald City, and Tip follows, carrying the army's belongings. Upon their arrival, the Guardian comes through the gates to greet them. The women ask him to surrender, and he deals out some early 20th century misogyny, which they don't take too kindly to. The army surrounds him and pokes him with their knitting needles. General Ginger seizes the Guardian's keys and is about to storm the city, but she is then confronted by the Royal Army of Oz. Unfortunately, that army consists of one man, the soldier with the green whiskers, and he also hasn't loaded his gun. Because of this, the Army of Revolt captures the Emerald City. Tip slips away as the army steals the emeralds. He and the soldier manage to arrive at the palace and find Scarecrow and Jack playing quoits in the courtyard. They announce that the city has been conquered, and the Scarecrow tells them to bar all the doors and windows while he shows Jack how to throw a quoit. Tip and Jack have their father-son reunion, and the soldier informs the king about the regiment of women. The Scarecrow is not upset to lose his throne, because being king is tiresome and the crown he wears gives him a headache. But when Tip mentions that the army intends to make a rag carpet with the Scarecrow's outside and stuff sofa cushions with his insides, the Scarecrow sees it fit to plan an escape. The Scarecrow decides to seek refuge with the Tin Woodman, who is now the Emperor of the Winkies. The army surrounds the palace, and Jack has an existential crisis because he's scared that his pumpkin head will spoil and his life will be short. The soldier fetches the sawhorse, and the Scarecrow suspects they can all ride out on its back. The sawhorse can only seat 3, so they opt to leave the soldier behind because the Scarecrow has little confidence in his powers. To ensure that Tip, Jack, and the Scarecrow don't fall off the horse, the soldier fetches a clothesline to tie them all together. The sawhorse bursts through the gates, knocking over several girls, and he runs so fast that Tip can barely catch his breath. They escape the city and come to a river. The sawhorse can't stop in time, so he makes a final leap and lands in the water. Everyone gets soaked, but they float among the surface. Tip calls out to Jack to see if he's alright, but there is no answer. He calls out to the Scarecrow. He says that he is all wrong. Despite not hearing anything from Jack, Tip orders the sawhorse to paddle to the shore. Tip cuts them free and takes a look at Jack to find that his pumpkin head is no longer on his body. He sees the pumpkin floating in the water, slowly bobbing towards the shore. Tip grabs a long pole and pulls it towards him. He replaces Jack's head and then goes to help the Scarecrow. He takes the straw from his body and lays it in the sun to dry. When everyone is feeling better, they remount the sawhorse and start for the Tin Woodman. The Scarecrow feels nostalgic for his first journey with Dorothy. They come across the same area where they fought off the Wicked Witch of the West's bees, wolves, and monkeys. This is also the first time the name Nick Chopper is mentioned, which is the Tin Woodman's true name. When evening comes, Tip announces that he is both tired and hungry. His other 3 companions are not made of flesh and therefore do not have the same concerns, but they agree to be considerate of each other despite their respective weaknesses. Tip uses the Scarecrow as a pillow and falls asleep. Tip awakens the next morning, and the Scarecrow picks some berries for him to appease his hunger with. Afterwards, they ride for an hour and arrive at the city of the Winkies. The Scarecrow is eager to see his friend again, but the palace guard announces that the Emperor is being polished and is not seeing any guests. The Scarecrow tells him to announce their arrival anyways, which the guard does. They are let inside, and the Tin Woodman eventually arrives to greet them. He and the Scarecrow celebrate a loving reunion. The Scarecrow then introduces his companions, and the Tin Woodman is delighted to meet them all. The Scarecrow informs the Tin Woodman about the uprising in the Emerald City, and Tip includes that he overheard that they were going to capture the Tin Woodman's castle next. The Emperor is confident that the 5 of them alone can overthrow the army of revolt. The Scarecrow is laundered, the Sawhorse is inspected, and Tip reinforces Jack's limbs, making them all stronger and more presentable. The next morning, they make their way back to recapture the Emerald City. Before I move on, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to all of you about Anchor. Anchor is a free and easy-to-use podcast creator that allows you to record and edit your own podcast from your phone or your computer. They will also distribute your podcast, making it accessible on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other platforms. Again, it is totally free. In fact, you can actually make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership required. Anchor is everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Back at the Emerald City, General Ginger grows concerned that the Scarecrow may join forces with the Tin Woodman, so she sends for Mombi to assist her. Mombi has no hesitations getting involved, still being furious with Tip's escape. She hides in a tower and uses magic to throw Tip, Jack, the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and the Sawhorse off their tracks. Eventually, they come across an unfamiliar sunflower field. Tip notices that the flowers are spinning at the top of their stalks and proclaims that it's witchcraft. The Tin Woodman prepares to chop down the flowers with his axe, but they notice women's faces in the center of each flower. Tip announces that they are living girls, and the Tin Woodman retreats, as it would be heartless to kill them. Tip suspects Mombi is behind this illusion, and the crew advances without acknowledging the false flowers. After many yards, the way is cleared. Along the way, the Sawhorse breaks one of his legs in a rabbit hole. Without wood nearby, the leg cannot be replaced. While they try to come up with a solution, a strange figure starts approaching them. He says good morning and presents his card, which reads Mr. H.M. Wogglebug T.E. He explains that H.M. stands for highly magnified and T.E. stands for thoroughly educated. The Wogglebug has the tall and round body of a bug with 2 legs and 2 arms, nicely fitted in a blue coat. He has a feeler for a nose and 2 antennae for ears, which sit between a tall silk hat. The Scarecrow admits his sudden arrival has startled them, so the Wogglebug offers to tell him his history so they can better understand him. He was born as an ordinary Wogglebug, several thousand times smaller than the size he is now. One day, he crawled near a country schoolhouse and decided to listen in on the lectures of the famous scholar Professor Know-It-All. The Wogglebug lived in that schoolhouse for 3 years before he was caught by the professor. He showed the Wogglebug to his students and then placed him on a microscope to project a magnified image of the bug on a screen. When the bug noticed he was on screen, he stood on his hind legs and took a bow. It startled the students as well as the professor, and they all fled. While everyone was outside, the Wogglebug secretly jumped off of the screen, still in his highly magnified state, and has remained the same size ever since. The Wogglebug announces that he was planning to go to the Emerald City to give lectures on the advantages of magnification. Since his newfound friends are going to the same place, they offer to travel with him to the Emerald City. He then learns of the Sawhorse's broken leg and Jack's need to ride on account of his stiff joints. The Wogglebug recommends using one of Jack's legs to make a leg for the Sawhorse, since Jack wouldn't be walking anyway. The Tin Woodman proceeds in amputating Jack's leg and whittling it to fit the Sawhorse. Neither of them are happy with this, and it leads to a small verbal altercation between the two, but they are calmed down by the Tin Woodman, and the Scarecrow leads them all in the direction of the Emerald City. Later on, when they stop to allow rest for Tip, the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman notice that they are in the territory of the field mice. The Tin Woodman blows a whistle, and the Queen of the Field Mice appears. The Scarecrow asks if a dozen mice will hide in his straw, as he intends to use them as a scare tactic to regain the throne. The Queen obliges, and a dozen mice go into the Scarecrow's jacket. They also ask if the Queen will direct them to the Emerald City, as Mombi is trying to prevent them from finding their way. She agrees, and they continue their journey. With their new guide, they are immune to Mombi's illusions, and it isn't long before they arrive at the Emerald City gates. The Queen promptly rushes home as they approach 2 female guards from the Army of Revolt. The Tin Woodman swings his axe, causing these guards to flee and allowing our protagonists safe entry into the city. Once inside, they find that the men are being forced to sweep, dust, and wash dishes while the women enjoy their newfound free time. A man notices the Scarecrow and begs him to reverse the army's orders, finding their duties tiresome. The Scarecrow asks, "If it is such hard work as you say, how did the women manage it so easily?" This stumps the man, and he responds with, "Perhaps the women are made of cast iron." When they arrive at the palace, they see that all the emeralds have been taken, and that General Ginger is sitting on the Scarecrow's throne. The Scarecrow accuses her of committing treason, but Ginger states that she is now the Queen, making anyone who opposes her guilty of treason. The laws confuse the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman reassures him, saying, "Laws were never meant to be understood, and it is foolish to make the attempt." The Wogglebug suggests that the Scarecrow marries the Queen so they both can rule. Jack suggests that she be sent back to her mother. Tip suggests that she be locked in a closet until she behaves, and the Sawhorse suggests violence. Queen Ginger signals her army, which steals the Tin Woodman's axe and surrounds the entire room. The Queen assures that she means no ill will towards them, but she threatens to destroy them if they prove to be troublesome. The Scarecrow then releases the mice, which scare Ginger and the army out of the palace. Fearing that the army may return, the Scarecrow orders his friends to bar all of the entrances to the palace. Tip sees that several soldiers are still surrounding the palace. They conclude that they have not yet succeeded in taking over the Emerald City and that they are still prisoners of Queen Ginger. They grow anxious that she will return and fulfill her promise of destroying them, so the Scarecrow decides they need to find a way to escape. Tip sits down and the powder of life falls out of his pocket. He explains its powers to his inquisitive companions, and the Scarecrow believes it could be instrumental in their escape. The Scarecrow peacefully leaves his crown behind as an offering to Queen Ginger, and he begins to think of an escape route. He concludes that if they try to escape on the ground, they will be captured by the Army of Revolt. Therefore, to be successful, they need to escape by air. He recalls how the wizard escaped in a balloon, so he asks the Tin Woodman to build a machine with wings, which Tip can then bring to life using Mombi's powder of life. Before they begin construction, though, the Tin Woodman gives Jack a new leg, allowing him to assist in their escape plan. The crew gathers an assortment of supplies and places them on the roof for construction. The Wogglebug supplies a taxidermied head of a gump, which is a fictional animal resembling an elk and a billy goat. Tip brings 2 sofas, Jack brings a broom, the Scarecrow arrives with ropes, and the Tin Woodman arrives with 4 large leaves from the Emerald City's royal palm tree. The Scarecrow is mortified, as the Tin Woodman had just committed one of the worst crimes possible. The tree is sacred to the city, and the penalty for chopping its leaves is to be killed 7 times and afterward imprisoned for life. The Tin Woodman is unfazed by this news, and he gets to work on their machine. He fastens both of the sofas together, attaches the gump's head to one end, sticks the palm leaves into the sides, and affixes the broom to serve as a tail. Tip sprinkles the remainder of the powder of life all over their creation and recites the magic words. The gump instantly comes to life and flaps his wings furiously, nearly blowing Tip and the Scarecrow off the roof. The gump adjusts to his new body, expressing that the last thing he remembers was walking in the forest and hearing a loud noise. Tip explains he is just a thing with a gump's head on it, and that they created him with the purpose of transportation. The gump exhibits some pessimistic behavior, being unsure how he feels about his new identity and stating that he has a weak constitution. The Scarecrow recommends that they travel to the south to see Glinda the Good. This idea is universally accepted, so everyone boards the gump and flies away. Night comes faster than expected, and Tip begins to wonder if they should have waited to fly until the morning. The Scarecrow examines the powder of life and discovers that the container has a false bottom. Tip unscrews the bottom, finding 3 silver pills with a piece of paper that reads, "Dr. Nicodick's Celebrated Wishing Pills," and lists instructions on how to grant wishes. Tip recalls Dr. Nicodick as the person who gave Mombi the powder of life. One of the instructions for the pills reads, "Count to 17 by 2s," and they conclude the pills are useless, as 17 is an odd number and can't be counted with 2s. The night gets darker, but the gump continues flying. Tip grows concerned that maybe the gump can't find his way to Glinda's palace. Shortly after this, dawn breaks and they see an unfamiliar village below them. The Scarecrow announces that they must have gotten lost and that the Gump flew out of the land of Oz entirely, over the sandy deserts, and into a country surrounding Oz. The Gump is ordered to land at the next level place he can find so he can be turned around and they can fly back. The Gump, being an inexperienced flyer, misses the rock he intended to land on and breaks off 2 of his wings. The sofas tumble down a cliff and all of the passengers are launched from the vessel. They are not injured in the fall, but they do find themselves in a large jackdaw's nest suspended hundreds of feet in the air. They hear wings flapping above them and see that the jackdaws are returning to the nest. The Tin Woodman covers Tip, Jack's head, and the Wogglebug with the Scarecrow's straw to hide them. The only thing he spares is the Scarecrow's head, and the job is finished just before the jackdaws arrive to attack the intruders. The Tin Woodman swings his axe, which helps a bit, but he is outnumbered by the birds. They try to peck out the Gump's eyes and attack the Sawhorse, but they are not harmed. The horse is actually thrown onto his back, and he swings his wooden legs at the birds and succeeds in injuring some of them. The birds begin to retaliate by throwing the Scarecrow's straw off the cliff. The combined efforts of the Tin Woodman's axe swinging and the Gump's wing flapping succeeds in scaring the birds away. Everyone comes out of hiding and rejoices in their victory, until the Scarecrow reminds them that he is now just a head with no straw to stuff his body. The jackdaws had succeeded in throwing all of the Scarecrow's straw over the cliff. The crew digs through the nest for straw alternatives, and they find thousands of dollar bills. They decide to stuff the Scarecrow with the money they find. They then refocus their attention on the wishing pills to ensure their escape. They struggle to find the proper method of counting to 17 by 2s. This stumps even the thoroughly educated Wogglebug. The Sawhorse suggests that they start counting at 1/2. This genius statement stuns the group because they all consider the Sawhorse as the most stupid of the entire party. I'm not kidding, that's actually a direct quote from the book. The Wogglebug swallows a pill and starts counting with 1/2, doubling it to get to 1, and then counting by 2 until he reaches 17. I don't know why they couldn't have just started at 1 instead of 1/2, but regardless, after he reaches 17, the bug wishes for the Gump's wings to be mended. Suddenly, the Gump is in perfect repair and in excellent condition to fly to Glinda's palace. They decide to wait until daylight to fly so they can avoid repeating their mistake from the night before. The next morning, the adventurers take to the skies before the jackdaws can return. The Gump flies north over the desert, eventually flying over blue dome-shaped houses. They discover that they are in Munchkin country and therefore a long distance from Glinda. The Wogglebug decides to swallow another pill to shorten their journey, but they discover that the Scarecrow accidentally left the wishing pills in the jackdaw's nest. They continue to fly, eventually coming across Quadling country. The Gump lands at Glinda's palace and they marvel at the beauty of Glinda's gardens. Glinda's private bodyguard, a female captain, recognizes the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and greets them. She announces that Glinda knew they were coming and is eagerly awaiting to see them. They all proceed directly into the throne room. The Scarecrow announces to Glinda that the Emerald City has been taken over by the Army of Revolt and that they threaten to destroy him and his companions. This is not new information to Glinda, who tells them that General Ginger is now queen and she cannot oppose her. She also explains that the Wizard of Oz had stolen the throne from the rightful King Pastoria and hid his daughter in some secret place which Glinda has been unable to discover. The wizard never had the right to crown anyone. In fact, the rightful heir to the throne is Pastoria's missing daughter, Ozma. Glinda decides to look through a record book which contains every known action of the wizard while he was in Oz, with the hopes of discovering Ozma's whereabouts. Until any lead is found, Glinda allows everyone to stay at the palace. The next morning, she reveals she found 3 suspicious actions performed by the wizard. 1. He ate beans with a knife. 2. He limped slightly on his left foot. And 3. He paid 3 secret visits to Mombi. Glinda believes the two of them met to exchange secrets of magic, and that Mombi helped him hide Ozma, as the princess was the biggest threat to the wizard taking the throne. They all plan to march to the Emerald City the next day with Glinda's army, and take Mombi prisoner until she tells the truth about Ozma. Glinda's army of women assembles in the morning, and they are led to the Emerald City, while the Scarecrow and his comrades ride in the Gump. Their journey takes a day, but the army quietly surrounds the city in the dark of the night. When day breaks, General Ginger is alerted of the army surrounding them, which is much more threatening because they have spears and swords, while Ginger and her army only have knitting needles. Ginger immediately surrenders, sending one of her soldiers out of the city with a white flag. Glinda tells the girl that Ginger must deliver Mombi to them. Mombi, however, uses her magic to deceive Glinda. She summons Jellia Jam and enchants her to look exactly like Mombi herself. The soldiers deliver Jellia to Glinda and return to the city. After a brief interrogation regarding Ozma, Jellia becomes nervous and reveals that she is not the true Mombi. Glinda sends word to Ginger to deliver the real Mombi or suffer terrible consequences. Ginger and Mombi were already well prepared with a new trick, and the general tells Glinda's messenger that she cannot find Mombi anywhere. She does offer to let Glinda and her friends inside the city to look for Mombi themselves, but they must leave if they cannot find her by sundown. Glinda agrees to this, and they all march into the city. As sundown approaches, Glinda admits defeat as they are unable to find Mombi. The disappointed travelers make their way out of the city, but the Tin Woodman plucks a large red rose on his way out to cheer himself up. The next morning, Glinda summons her friends to her tent to discuss their next steps. While the Tin Woodman is speaking, Glinda notices that the rose he was holding is slightly moving. She immediately makes the conclusion that Mombi had transformed herself into a rose to hide from Glinda, and the Tin Woodman was just lucky enough to carry that particular rose out of the city with him the day prior. Mombi, having been found out, then turns into a shadow to escape. Glinda secures the exit to make sure that Mombi cannot leave the tent. Mombi then takes the form of an ant, but she is quickly discovered by Glinda. At the last moment, she transforms herself into a large griffin, tearing through the tent and flying away. Glinda hops onto the sawhorse's back and orders him to follow the griffin. He runs faster than he ever had before, and they are out of sight before any of their companions can recover from the excitement. The remainder of the crew boards the Gump to fly after Glinda. After about an hour, the griffin tires and lands in the desert, completely exhausted. Glinda throws a golden thread from her girdle onto the griffin, which destroys Mombi's illusion. Everyone returns to Glinda's camp with Mombi as their prisoner. Upon their arrival, Glinda asks her to tell the truth about the wizard and Ozma. Mombi does not say a word. Glinda threatens to punish her with death if she does not speak. If Mombi does reveal the truth, however, Glinda will take away all of her powers but will allow her to live. Mombi reluctantly agrees to answer Glinda's questions. One of Glinda's captains brings her a pearl and a golden chain, which she puts around her neck. Mombi states that the wizard paid a visit to her to find out how she makes tea biscuits. The pearl on Glinda's necklace turns black, which means Mombi is lying. Admitting that her last effort at deceit is unsuccessful, she confesses that the wizard brought Ozma to her. Mombi reveals that she had turned Ozma into a boy. She points to Tip and exclaims, "That is the rightful ruler of the Emerald City." Tip is very upset to hear this news, proclaiming that he would like to maintain his boyhood and go on adventures with his friends. However, he agrees to be turned into a girl temporarily, telling Glinda that she must promise to change him into a boy again if he does not enjoy being a girl. However, Glinda can't perform transformations, so this change seems to be permanent. Glinda forces Mombi to restore Tip to his true form as her last act of magic. Using a combination of potions, fire, and dry herbs, she successfully completes the transformation. Where Tip formerly stood, Ozma appeared. She has beautiful eyes and long golden hair, and she is wearing silk robes with satin slippers. Ozma assures her friends that she is the same old Tip, she is just a different gender. When Ginger learns of Ozma's return, she and her soldiers decide to resist Ozma. The next day, Glinda and her army arrive at the Emerald City with the intention of laying siege. The Scarecrow recommends they fly into the city on the Gump, which they do instead. They travel with some of Glinda's soldiers who immediately seize Ginger and chain her wrists. The army of revolt surrenders upon seeing their leader imprisoned. Glinda announces that Princess Ozma will be claiming the throne of her royal ancestors. Ozma's first act as queen is ordering the army of revolt to return all of the gems and emeralds they had stolen from the city. The army is then disbanded, and Ginger is released from imprisonment on the promise of good behavior. Ozma receives royal advice from Glinda and appoints the Wogglebug as the public educator. The Gump requests that he be taken apart as he never wanted to be alive and is ashamed of his new form. Ozma obliges and the Gump's head is returned above a mantle, but the head is still a living creature and this cannot be reversed. The Sawhorse becomes Ozma's steed, with his legs now being plated in gold to prevent wearing. Jack remains with Ozma to the end of his days, and he does not spoil as quickly as he fears. The Tin Woodman returns to rule over the Winkies, appointing the Scarecrow as his royal treasurer. The Scarecrow and the Tin Man debate their riches, comparing them to money, brains, and heart. Ozma explains that their riches are the only riches worth having. They have the riches of content. I loved this book. It was absolutely bonkers. It was a lot funnier than its predecessor, and the humor seems to be more purposeful this time. There's a lot of cute banter between the characters, which was likely for comedic effect, but in the second half of the book it started to feel a lot less necessary, and it seemed to drag. It was entertaining at first, but then it began to feel like a tactic used by the author to increase the book's length. There are a lot of really interesting new characters here. I thought it was smart to depart from Dorothy's story to focus on some other characters in the Land of Oz. In the author's note at the beginning, he explains that thousands of children wrote to him asking about the further adventures of the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman in particular. Baum definitely wanted them to carry a deal of the plot because our protagonist Tip does fade into the background a bit when our returning characters reappear. In fact, the narration shifts from Tip and his companions to the Scarecrow and his comrades about halfway through the story. I didn't mind this as much because I too was curious to know what became of the characters after Dorothy was sent back to Kansas, and Tip ends up having a pretty dope revelation at the end of this book. I could also tell there were some clear connections to the women's suffrage movement. Knowing Baum's personal connection to activist Matilda Gage, I am sure she had an influence on the characters of Glinda and General Ginger, despite how different the two of them were in their intentions. Ginger's army clearly is a direct reference to this particular movement with their desire to have men make room for women to have more of a say in who rules over them, and having men take over some of the household duties that in the early 20th century are expected to be performed by women. Of course, the book is still dated and is not completely devoted to this cause, granted some misogynistic statements made by certain characters, but the characters of Glinda and Ginger in particular definitely reflect the suffrage movement. It's also really exciting that the ruler of Oz is a woman. I feel like there aren't a lot of these types of stories in literature from this time period, so that's really cool. I'm still a bit confused about one specific plot hole, which is whatever happens to the green glasses in the Emerald City. I know Jack and the Sawhorse are fitted with them when they first arrive to talk to the Scarecrow, but to my recollection, they're not removed at any point. It seems as if they don't need to wear the glasses when the Army of Revolt has taken the gems, and that makes sense to me. But when Ozma takes the throne and the jewels are replaced, does she require the citizens to wear green glasses again? Again, maybe I missed something and maybe it'll be addressed in a future book, but it's one of the only things that stumped me. I also will admit I'm not sure if I should be referring to the Tin Woodman as Nick Chopper. The narrator calls him both, and then occasionally calls him the Emperor. The Scarecrow seems to be the only character who calls him Nick, and I presume that's because they're close friends, so out of respect, I will call him the Tin Woodman. From here on out, I would like to close these episodes with some of my favorite quotes from the content I am reviewing. So here are some notable sentences from the marvelous Land of Oz. "Do not, I beg you, dampen today's sun with the showers of tomorrow," said by the Tin Woodman. "Everything in life is unusual until you get accustomed to it," said by the Scarecrow. "I am convinced that the only people worthy of consideration in this world are the unusual ones, for the common folks are like the leaves of a tree and live and die unnoticed," said by the Scarecrow. "I am only remarkable because I can't help it," said by the Sawhorse. Thank you again for listening in. If you have any interest in supporting the podcast, you can visit anchor.fm/OzRecap. I hope to create some video companions to some of these episodes in the future, and becoming a supporter would help me better create content for my fellow Oz fans. If you are interested in reading the Oz series along with me, all of Baum's novels are in the public domain and available online for free. They're easy to read, and the illustrations alone are so interesting to behold. You are now all members of my Oz book club. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Well, that's all I've got. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at OzRecap for updates and more Oz content. Until next time, I'm Justin, and this has been the wonderful recap of Oz.